Part 4 of the Hearst Amateur Radio Club General License Upgrade class that they put on in October of 2019. Question pool lasts from 2019 to 2023. This is part 4. This is the beginning of the second day. There were 3 nights of this class. Each night was 2 to 3 hours long. And when I last posted the class they did last 2 or 3 years ago from the last question pool, I posted 3 episodes on YouTube that were 2 to 3 hours long each, and that was just too long, I think. So I decided to split these up. I kind of did this at the last minute. Decided to split these up. The first night I split up into 3 classes, parts 1, 2, and 3. This is part 4, which is the first part of the second night. So here it is. Check it out. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Shut up and sit down.
I want to welcome you back to session 2 of the Amateur Radio General Class License Training. This evening we're going to go over how radio waves get from one place to another. We're going to talk about propagation. We're going to talk about some components, electronic components. We'll talk about some systems, the pieces that make up transmitters and receivers and things like that. We'll talk about those in general, and that's where we're going to take off now, unless you got any questions before we start. Okay, talk about propagation. Propagation is to study how radio waves travel from one point to another. That's called propagation. Radio waves travel in essentially three different ways. Line of sight propagation. And that pretty much means about what it says, about as far as you can see. Line of sight propagation is typically limited by the horizon. Okay, so you're not going to go much past the horizon. That's line of sight propagation. UHF and VHF is primarily line of sight propagation. The higher you get, if you get up on a tower, you can see farther, your radio waves will go farther. And of course, if you're up in space above the horizon, there's practically no limit till the radio waves just attenuate in space. There's ground wave propagation. That's propagation that goes past the line of sight. It kind of hugs the ground. It goes farther than the line of sight. There's skywave propagation. Skywave propagation is the stuff that bounces off the ionosphere up in the sky, gives you global communications. You can talk around the world with skywave propagation. So line of sight is when your sight travels directly from one antenna to another. It's limited by the horizon. Ground wave, it kind of hugs the ground. It goes farther than the line of sight. That's ground wave propagation. A lot of propagation. Some if you're not talking about E-skip propagation, a lot of propagation on 6 meters and stuff like that sometimes is ground wave propagation. If you talk from here to Oklahoma on HF, you're talking on ground wave propagation. You're not typically talking on skywave propagation unless we talk about NVIS. And then there's skywave propagation. That's when your radio waves bounce off the ionosphere. They're bent back to Earth, reflected back to Earth. And they cover quite a distance. You can talk from one continent to the other. With multiple bounces, you can talk around the world. And we're going to talk more about, kind of focus on skywave propagation. Skywave propagation up in the ionosphere. Skywave propagation is formed by ultraviolet solar radiation from the sun. When it bombards the ionosphere, we end up with some ionized layers, and these ionized layers are reflective. They'll reflect radio waves. It bombards the gas and causes the ions to form. And when we talk about the layers, we talk about 4 different distinct layers. We talked about the D layer, which is the closest to Earth, the E layer, which is above the D layer, the F1 layer, and the F2 layer. And these are each farther away from the Earth. The stronger the ultraviolet radiation, the stronger these waves and the more reflective or refractive the ionospheric layers are. It takes solar radiation, ultraviolet radiation, about 8 minutes to come from the sun down to the Earth. So when you talk about ultraviolet radiation, it's there when the sun's there. The stronger the sun is, like midday, you're going to have stronger propagation than you're going to have in the evening. It's going to be weaker in the morning because you're not getting full sunlight. It's going to be weaker in the evening because you're not getting full sunlight. At midday, it's going to be the strongest. Now, this varies but by how much ionosphere or ultraviolet radiation that the sun is emitting. Sunspots increase the ultraviolet radiation and enhances propagation. So when there's a lot of sunspots and the solar disturbances on the sun we call sunspots, they're going to create more ultraviolet radiation. This runs in a cycle. It runs in about an 11-year cycle. Right now, we're at the bottom of the 11-year cycle. So there's not very, very little sunspot radiation. And the ionospheric layers now during the day are very weak. In a few years, when we start up and the solar radiation begins to increase, the sunspot begins to increase, the sunspot cycle goes up, we're going to find these layers become stronger and stronger and more, and the propagation, these layers, are going to be more and more enhanced, and they're going to reflect radio waves much better. So we're at the bottom of the cycle right now. The number of sunspots is a measure of solar activity. How you talk about, well, how do I measure this? Well, they measure it by number of sunspots or sunspot groups. That's the measure of solar radiation. Right now, if you look out for a propagation index, you'll find some of those online, propagation index. You'll talk about the sunspot number. The sunspot numbers right now are very low. There's practically no sunspots. In times in which the sunspot numbers are high, when there's observed greater number of sunspots, the solar radiation is much better, the UV radiation. So sunspot numbers are a measure of solar activity. That's how we measure it. One of the ways that we measure it this way. During those periods of low solar activity, the frequencies on 21 megahertz and above, 15 meters, 17 meters, 10 meters, 12 meters, they're pretty much dead. You don't hear much activity on those at all. Every once in a while, there'll be a little spike in that, and you may be a day or two in which you get real good propagation on 10 meters, and it goes away again. But during the peak of the sunspot cycles, you can work 10 meters, all these bands, you can work around the world. I worked all over the world on 10 meters when the sunspot's good. I'm lucky to talk another state now that sunspot's bad. Yes, sir?
What is the sunspot number when it's starting to get better? What number would you be looking at?
Gosh, I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
I can find that out for you, but I don't remember right now. I just look, and when they're down around zero and are real low, I just pay attention. And we pretty much, once you know that we're in the bottom of the sunspot cycle, you don't expect anything. But every once in a while, you can look at some of the predictions online, or you can look at some of the reports, and you may see a sunspot number come up. It goes up. Look what it was yesterday and the day before. If it's higher today, you're probably going to hear more activity on the radio. But I couldn't tell you right now what a good sunspot number is. Now, not all radio waves, not all frequencies behave the same. This also is dependent on frequency. So this is part of working propagation. This is part of the skill of amateur radio, is to use the right frequency and the right mode at the right time to do what it is you want to do or talk to where you want to talk. For example, the lower frequencies. We talk about lower frequencies, 160 meters, for example, sometimes 80 meters, broadcast band, which is down in the AM band. Those lower frequencies are pretty much absorbed by that first layer, the D layer. So they don't usually go very far. So and the D layer is really active in the daytime. Now, higher frequencies are going to go right through the D layer, maybe through the E layer, and they're going to reflect off of one of these higher layers. And the higher layer you reflect off of course, the farther you go, it's geometry. This one here, you bounce off that, you come down here. This one here, you bounce off it, you come down way over here on the other side of the Earth. Some frequencies will go right through, typically go right through the ionosphere. UHF and VHF will typically go right through the ionosphere, which is good, because that's what we run our satellites on. Amateur radio satellites are usually on UHF and VHF frequencies. Well, they would be totally ineffective if they were blocked by the four layers here, the DE, F1, and F2 layers, if they were blocked by the ionospheric layers. So that's good. So if you want to talk to space, you use VHF and UHF. If you want to talk really long distances during the day, you might use 20 meters, because any stuff higher than that starts being absorbed in the D layer. So the exact frequencies vary hour to hour and day to day. It's based on the time of the day. It's based on the sunspot activity. It's based on the frequency. It's based on how active the propagation is. So they'll vary day to day. One day you may be able to talk well on 20 meters, maybe, or 40 meters, and the next day you may not be able to. Typically, the F2 layer is the region responsible for almost all long-distance communications on those when propagation is good on frequencies from 1.8 to 30 megahertz. And typically, due to the geometry of the Earth, the size of the Earth, and the distances those are away from the Earth, you can make 2,500 miles in one skip, one bounce. 2,500 miles is not unusual. The nice thing about that is the Earth is reflective, so it may bounce again and back around. It may take multiple hops all the way around the world. So if you talk to the other side of the world, you may be talking to the other side of the world on multiple bounce propagation. Multi-hop is what they call it. Pardon?
Does it matter what wattage?
When propagation is good, it really doesn't. When propagation is good, you can talk around the world on 5 watts. That's one of the challenges of QRP, or low power communications. A lot of people want to see how low power they can talk and how far they can talk on low power. 5 watts is typically considered to be QRP propagated, or QRP frequencies, low power frequencies. And there's a whole group of people out there and frequencies set aside that the QRP guys hang out and try to talk to one another. But no, it doesn't take a lot of power. Typically, your average multiband radio that you would buy, whether it's Alinco or ICOM or Yaesu or Kenwood, typically runs 100 watts. 100 watts peak envelope power. And that's enough to talk around the world with no problem at all when propagation is good. It's good enough to talk around the world even when propagation is not great. 100 watts is good. So during the day, that F region is split into 2 parts. It's called F1 and F2. It's caused by the sun. This stuff is generated by the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Let's look a little closer. We talk about these paths. We talked about ground wave signals. We talked about skywave signals. And we have something now called skip. Any of you guys ever been on CB? Okay. The CBers talk about talking on skip. Talking to skip. Okay. They think that means long distance. It doesn't. Long distance means where the signal's not at. Skip is, I'll show you what skip is. Here's my transmitting station here. And here's my receiving station over here. Okay. And they're quite a ways apart. And this is called the short path because I'm going directly to this. I'm not going around, bouncing around the world a long way around. Okay, I've got ground wave signals. I'm emitting signals, and some of mine are line of sight. Some of them are ground wave signals. The longest ones I've got are ground wave signals. They don't go too far. They go to about here on this chart. Then I've got my skywave signal along with this. It's going up on the F2 layer, and it's coming out here about 2,500 miles away. What I got here is covered by ground wave, covered by skywave. I got an area in here that I'm not covered by propagation. That's called a skip area. You've skipped over this station here. The radio waves skip completely over that station. It's too far for ground wave, too short for skywave. So it's called a skip zone. This zone in here, where between the ground wave and the skywave, is called a skip zone. It's not necessarily completely dead. You may hear a little bit in there. As the radio wave, the RF energy, goes up through the D layer, the E layer, and the F1 layer, a little bit of it scatters off. So you may hear a little brief signal every once in a while in there, or a weak signal. It's going to be kind of distorted, it's going to be kind of warbly, but there's also, you can get some scatter from the ionosphere. So you can hear some stuff and maybe operate in the skip zone using scatter. But that's not something you would necessarily count on. So scatter works in a skip zone, but the signal's going to be weak, signal's going to be fluttery, warbly, not a real good quality. So that's skip zone. It's the area too far for the ground wave and too close for skywave propagation.
And it's strictly HF then, huh?
Yeah, H is typically HF, yeah, that's what you're going to get in HF, because your UHF and VHF signals are going to go right through. Or they're going, if they don't go through, they're going to be limited by the horizon.
Back in the days when the AM stations would change their power level,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why KMOX made most of Middle America with cardinal bands.
Yeah, yeah.
They rode
Yep. Now, we talked about, let me show you something here. When we talked about, well, yeah, the last class, we said before you operate on a frequency, what do you do? When you pick a frequency, what do? Well, you listen, and you listen, and you listen. And you may even ask, is this frequency in use? Now, I haven't heard anything, and I ask, this frequency is in use. Why would I do that? If I don't hear anybody, does that mean there's nobody there? There could be two people talking. One guy is here in the ground wave, and the other guy is out there. Okay, you're here. He's here. Okay, you may be talking. He may be talking to this guy over here and hearing him just fine. You don't hear him because he's listening right then. Well, he may be listening when you say, is this frequency in use? He'll come back and go, yeah, it's in use. Well, wait, you ask yourself, why did I hear him and not hear the other guy? Because I was right on the edge of the skip zone, or I was in his ground wave. And the path from the other guy was in skip zone. That's why you'd ask if the frequency is in use, and that's why you listen for a while, too, when you're operating. Does that make sense? Okay. The angle of the radiation is important, too. Different type of antennas have different angles of radiation. If you want to talk a long way, you want an antenna that has a low angle of radiation, that the most of the energy leaves your antenna at a fairly low angle. Not a steep angle, a fairly low angle. If you want to talk to satellites, you want something with a steep angle. If you want to talk distance, you want something with a low angle. Because the lower the angle, the farther it goes. The higher the angle, the shorter it goes. Does that make sense? Again, it's geometry. If I throw a ball up here, it's going to drop there. If I throw a ball and hit the ceiling there, it's going to drop back there. But there's a limit to that. It gets to a point in which when you have your radiation angle high enough, it's going to blow right through the ionosphere. So that's called a critical angle. The critical angle is the highest angle that will reflect the signal back to Earth under given conditions. And we talk about given conditions, it's again, time of day, frequency, propagation, all that kind of stuff. It's not the same every day, and it's not the same all frequencies, and it's not the same in night as it is in the morning. So under given conditions, a critical angle is the highest angle that you can radiate, that it won't go right through the ionosphere, and it'll come back to Earth. Make sense? So if you want to talk HF, using the skip zone, remember the skip zone here, there's areas going to skip over. And talking in a skip zone, if I want to talk around the world, or I want to talk across the country, I want to use an antenna that radiates at low angle radiation because I want to get the most distance. However, if I do that, I can't talk to Oklahoma or Kansas because I skip over the top of them. So I may want also, if I want to talk to them, I may want to have an antenna that has a higher angle of radiation so that I get a shorter jump, a shorter hop. Sense?
I was going to say, does this apply to like a long wire and a beam antenna?
Yep. Every antenna has a radiation pattern. And there are things you can do, like change the length of the antenna, change the feed point of the antenna, change the elements of the antenna. If you've got a directional antenna that's intentionally directional, you can change that antenna up and down. You can change the distance between the reflectors and directors and get a different angle of radiation. Every antenna has a characteristic angle of radiation. Some have a high lobe, some have a low lobe. Or some have multiple lobes. They may have a high lobe and a low lobe. Different. That's
a long wire kind of is it more of a high normally?
Depends. It depends on how far it is above the ground. As your antennas get closer to the ground, if you put your antenna closer to the ground, your radiation angle gets higher. If you get your antenna up at a quarter wavelength above the ground, then you're at the optimal for whatever that antenna's characteristic is. So you can modify that. You can put an antenna close to the ground, and it'll radiate more vertically. You can raise that antenna up to a quarter wavelength, and the same antenna will radiate more horizontally. When I say horizontal or vertical, as far as the antenna pattern, the radiation pattern. Okay, these layers. The D layer, it's located about 60 miles, 35 to 60 miles above the Earth. It only lasts while exposed to the sun ray. 10 meters it works great on D layer during the daytime. The E layer is located about 60 to 70 miles above the Earth. It ionized last only while exposed to the sun's rays. And it makes pretty good, propagation is typically possible only during the day. So you got the two areas that are active during the day, the D layer and the E layer. The F1 and the F layer is split up into the F1 and F2. At night, okay, think of now, here's what's happened. At night, that D layer and that E layer go away. Because if you remember, they're only there, they're activated by the sun. They're only activated by the sun. So as soon as it gets dark, the D layer and the E layer start going away. They start dropping off at dusk, picking back up at dawn. And by the time you get in pretty much total darkness, the two layers, the F1 and the F2 layer, combine into a single layer called F, called the F layer. Now that's a real high layer. So you can talk, if you're right here, and remember, it's nighttime someplace, it's nighttime somewhere in the world. So you think about, they talk about working gray line. That's the line here where you're starting to get dusk or dawn. Now, you may have only been able to do short distance communications here, but if I have a low angle of radiation here, all of a sudden I can work a long distance because I can work in the F layer. I can pick up that F layer and bounce way over here. So communications on the other side of the world starts getting enhanced in the morning and the afternoon towards the dark side. We're working what they call the gray line.
And when you're talking to some people, like, you know, when your time difference is 8 hours, 12 hours, like here to China is 12.
Yeah.
You're at 8 hours. So
Yeah.
then you're, I guess, it's up to them if they want to be either up late or in the middle of the night or whatever. As long as you're bouncing off, if you're in the daytime and you're bouncing off at the daytime, you know, during the daytime, then they're still going to get it even though it's dark to them.
Yeah. It may be even more enhanced to them because it'll be a longer distance. Because every time you do a hop around the world, you lose some of your signal. Your signal's attenuated. So if you can keep it up in the ionosphere as long as possible, that's great. Now let me ask you something about the F layer. Someone talked about KMOX radio for the Cardinals. Why don't you hear them during the day? Here's why you don't hear them during the day. What did I tell you about the D layer? The D layer absorbs low frequency radio. Well, they're on an AM band. They're down real low. You don't hear them during the day because it's being absorbed in the St. Louis area. It's not going anywhere. All of a sudden now at night, the D layer, not only is the D layer gone, all you've got's the F layer. They got a long distance they can travel now without even changing power. And as a matter of fact, some stations are required to lower their power at night because they transmit farther, to keep them from transmitting too far and interfering with other stations on their frequency. So that's why you hear AM stations at night like KMOX, WLS in Chicago, those stations you don't normally hear because you're hearing them on the F layer now. They're bouncing off the F layer. They're no longer absorbed by the D layers or E layers. Solar flares, different than solar spots, different than sunspots. Solar flares are what's known as coronal mass ejections. Big, powerful explosion on the sun, if you want to think about it that way. Rather than looking at little spots on the sun, like you might see here and here, you see this big, huge mass of energy blow out of the side of the sun. Coronal mass ejections, there's powerful radiation comes out of that. Coronal mass ejections take longer than ultraviolet waves to come to Earth. Where UV rays typically take 8 minutes, coronal mass ejections takes them 20 to 40 hours to reach Earth. That's good because if when the people that can see a coronal mass ejection, if it's a massive one, can help warn us that we may have problems. Coronal mass ejection reaches the Earth, it causes what's called a geomagnetic storm. It really hypes up the energy at the poles, at the north and south poles, and then it starts wrapping down around the Earth from there. Northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere start seeing a lot of disturbance because of the geomagnetic storm. Geomagnetic storms can typically degrade HF communications, and they can also cause electric power surges in power grids. That stuff is so strong that power grids, your high tension lines, act like an antenna, and they'll pick up that energy, and they can overload substations and blow breakers and things like that. It really degrades HF propagation in the higher altitudes. You know, Wisconsin and north for us, maybe. But it also causes an aurora, the aurora borealis for us. And the aurora is good for VHF communications. You can bounce VHF communications off the aurora, and people delight in taking advantage of that. If you look at this, listen to the CD in the back of your book, Gordon West has some, I don't know if it's the technician or the general class one, he has some audio of some aurora communications. It's kind of warbly and fluttery sounding, but because they tend to be unstable, but it's good for VHF communications. They measure it in two ways. Geomagnetic stability measurements are measured two ways. The K-index measures short-term, the A-index measures long-term, and that's the stability of the Earth's geomagnetic field. Low index numbers means better radio communications. A low K-index number means that your radio communications is, and your geomagnetic field is stable. Radio communications will be relatively good, both for short-term and long-term. Higher numbers mean that they're being disturbed, and you can expect more interference, or you can expect a lot of dropout in frequencies. And it just flat out wipes it out. That's part of propagation as well. We talk about minimum usable frequencies and maximum usable frequencies. During the day, depending on the location, and this is between 2 points. This is not global, but you look at between 2 points. So I say, well, I'm interested in talking to Scotland, so I would be interested to see if I could do some research and find out what the maximum usable frequency and minimum usable frequencies is. So the location between my point and them, the direction between the 2 points, the time of the day, the season, the solar conditions, all those affect maximum usable frequency. Maximum usable frequency is the highest frequency. Well, let's see, if you look at your charts, it'll be, if you're doing low to high, it'll be the highest frequency on your band chart that you can talk on. So you can communicate on any of those frequencies lower than that until you get to the maximum usable frequency. After that, your radio energy is absorbed in the ionosphere. So as long as you're below the maximum usable frequency, that's exactly what it says. I can't use, it's the highest frequency I can use, maximum usable frequency. How can you tell? How can you tell what the maximum usable frequency is if you just want to listen? Well, there are beacon stations. There are stations all over the world that transmit. You can look up on the internet, and I even think there's some stuff in the back of your book about where some of the beacon stations are. All over the world, they transmit their call sign at a given period of time. And let's say I want to listen to, I'm listening to a 10-meter beacon or a 20-meter beacon. I'll listen to a 20-meter beacon. I'll listen to a 20-meter beacon. I'll look up a frequency for a 20-meter beacon, their time, and I'll see if one in Scotland or close to Scotland or somewhere in that area, because that's where I want to talk to. I'll look up that beacon, and I'll listen to see if I can hear it. If I can hear it, they can probably hear me. So I can use that frequency. Then I may go up to 10 meters and see whether I can do it on 10 meters. I go up 10 meters, I don't hear anything. That means I've probably gone over the maximum usable frequency. That's one of the ways to tell. Beacons are really handy. The good thing about it now is there's a beacon reporting network that we'll hit that in a minute. A beacon reporting network that I can look up now in which people actually log into it and provide information on who they've heard. So you can see online where propagation is going to. Maximum usable frequency will support communication between 2 given points. When you're selecting a frequency for lowest transmission attenuation, pick one just below the MUF, the MUF. Pick up one just below that. There's also, if there's a MUF There's also a lower usable frequency. The lowest usable frequency says this is far down as I can go and still make communications. Anything below that frequency is going to be attenuated. So what I have here now is I have my LUF and my MUF, my lowest and my highest, and between those two is where I can expect relatively optimum communications. What happens if the lower usable frequency equals or is greater than the maximum usable frequency? All is dead. You're not going to hear anything on any frequency. So if the LUF is greater than MUF, no HF communications over that path. So lower usable frequency is the lowest frequency I can count on using ionospheric propagation. The maximum usable frequency is the highest frequency I can count on. And I work in between. And of course, if one crosses the other, then I don't have any frequency open to me. Obscure. We talk about beacons. I got to get ahead of myself a little bit. Beacons are stations that are located worldwide. They transmit their call signs over and over to provide information about propagation. If you can hear a beacon station, then propagation will probably allow you to communicate to the location to where that beacon is at from where you are. If you can't hear it from where you are, then you can't hear it, so you probably can't communicate there. Pretty simple practice.
How often do they do their call sign? Every hour?
Oh, it's just every few minutes. Yeah.
How many watts are they put?
100. 100 is the maximum that you can use. A lot of beacon stations use less than that. I know a guy's got a 10-meter station. He just runs 5 watts. He runs 5 watts. He cycles off. He cycles on. And what the reason they cycle that is that so that you can listen, rather than having them scattered over a bunch of frequencies, they kind of share a frequency, so not everybody transmits at the same time. That's the whole idea of that.
And each amateur band has these?
Yeah. 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 Now there's something called, this is what I'm talking about, the reverse beacon network. Instead of beacons actively transmitting the signals, the reverse beacon network is a network of stations listening to the band. They're already doing the listening for you and reporting what stations they hear and when and how well. Now this doesn't rely on only beacon stations. They're listening to anybody who's participating. It's called one of the there's a called weak signal propagation reporter, WSPR, called Whisper is what they call it. And it's a component of the reverse beacon network. And this is low power stuff. And this is one of those deals where if these guys can get through, anybody can get through. There's an example of it's not clear enough to tell what frequency, but you look on their page on the frequency, for example, 15 meters, it'll show you what all they've heard on 15 meters. Reverse beacon networks log reception information for each other's stations. So there's people who agree to participate in this. And this way you don't have to listen. They're doing the listening for you. You can go on, use the reverse beacon network, or you can become part of the reverse beacon network by having a whisper beacon station if you want. And you can see where propagation is good to. See right here, it's like propagation is pretty good here. And propagation is pretty good here. Not much communications up in the north, though. So what's a nice, looking at the reverse beacon network is a nice way of being able to tell what bands are open, what you should listen for, and where you should be expected to hear signals from. Now, let's say you're using a directional antenna, and like a Yagi. What you want to do is you want to say, well, I want to use a Yagi. I want to focus most of my energy, RF energy, in one direction and not in the other. And I want to hear in that same direction, and I'm not interested in all the rest of the stations and noise all around me, so I want increased power, effective power, and I want to decrease in the amount of the noise floor. I'll use a directional antenna. And a lot of people use directional antennas. A lot of people use beam antennas, Yagis. So how do you know where to point? If you want to talk to someplace, how do you know where to point it? Which direction to point it? Well, you use an azimuthal projection map. An azimuthal projection map shows you the azimuth, or the horizontal compass reading on where places are at. Okay, let's say I want to do South America. What would I use? I'd turn my antenna to about 140 or 150. That says 140 there and 150 there. I'd turn my antenna to about 140, 150, and that's where I would point my antenna to transmit and receive. If I wanted to do Hawaii, well, from here, this map's plotted, and I just told it. I went online, I said, plot me a map from Colleyville, Texas, and it did. It's right there in the middle. If I want to talk to Hawaii, about 275. Point my beam to 275, and I should be pointing directly at Florida. That's called an azimuthal projection map. So that's a good tool. It shows you how to get to short and long path headings. If I wanted to, if it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe, and I wanted to talk to Europe, maybe, instead of going this way, I want to go that way and pick up that high F layer. That being the case, I'd turn my beam to 90 degrees, taking the long path around on the Earth. Sometimes you can't work the short path, but you can work the long path.
So do you have like an antenna, like my husband stuck an antenna up on our chimney? How are you gonna go change your antenna direction?
What depends on what kind of, well, if you've got a beam antenna, it'd be rotatable. You'll put up an antenna that rotates.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And do you have to get up there and physically do it?
No, put a motorized rotator on it,
Oh,
like
that's what I
like
was thinking.
a television antenna.
With all high tech nowadays, seems like you'd have some sort of like remote control and it's up there and you can just like.
Might want to look up on the roof and see if they have a beam antenna up there. I know they have one down at W5YI in Arlington. They have a beam antenna down there. Oh yeah, that's a popular thing. People get like a Mosley beam antenna, a 3-band antenna, or 3-element antenna, or 2 or 3-element antenna. They put a $300 or $400, $500 rotator on it. It's got a box. If you want to go north, you just select north, and it rotates the antenna for you and stops. It comes back. A lot of the folks that do satellite communications also use beam antennas because they want to track the satellites. And their beam antennas, this is going to be UHF and VHF, but their antennas, they have a set of antennas that track both this way and that way. So it's got 2 sets of rotators on it. And there's software out there that will track that antenna and automate your antenna so it'll follow the satellite as it goes over. It'll turn if it needs to turn, raise the antenna up and down if it needs to raise it up and down. So that's what you do. That's how you would do that. But if you know, this is how you know which way to point. You can have this custom made, just print it out for your house. Review. Ionospheric layers are produced by UV radiation from the sun. That's the principle. D layer is closest to the Earth. Next one is the E layer. It's next closest. Next layer is F layer. It's the third one from the Earth, and the F2 layer is the farthest one from the Earth. That's how they stack up. At night, the D layer and E layers disappear, and they combine into one nice big high fat F layer, a single F layer. Not all radio waves are refracted by UV layers, remember that. Lower frequencies, like AM broadcast, maybe 160 meters, are absorbed during the daytime by the D layer. Higher frequency signals than that typically will bounce off the F1 and F2 layers. And the UHF and VHF, they'll go right through all this mess, right out in space. The single hop, a good single hop on the F2 layer, that's where you're going to get your longest propagation during the day. A single hop is about 2,500 miles. Where on the E layer, a single hop is about 600 miles. You'll see more E hops on things like 6 meters is a good band for E hop. The area too far for a ground wave propagation and too short for ionosphere propagation is known as a skip zone. You can still hear in the skip zone. Sometimes the waves, the information, the radio waves will scatter out. You'll get a little weak amount of that scattering off as it goes through the other layers. They have kind of a fluttery sound and they're distorted because they've gone through multiple paths back to Earth. What's critical angle? That's the highest angle of radiation that you can have that'll still bounce off or refract off the ionosphere. Any higher than that angle is going to go straight through, just like it was UHF or VHF. And that depends on the time of the day, frequency, season of the year, depends on a lot of stuff. So it's variable. It may not be the same every day. Maximum usable frequency is the highest frequency that you can expect that's usable for communications between 2 given points. The LUF, the lowest usable frequency, is the lowest frequency. It's reliable for reliable communications between any given points. And when the lowest usable frequency and the maximum usable frequency exceeds one another or meets one another, there's no skywave propagation at all. Geomagnetic storm. That's temporary disturbance in the Earth's magnetosphere caused by a coronal mass ejection. Usually that radiation from the coronal mass ejection usually takes about 20 to 40 hours to reach the Earth. It degrades HF propagation, produces auroras, which are good for VHF propagation. It's measured with a K-index. The K-index indicates the short-term stability of the Earth's magnetic field, and the A-index indicates the long-term stability of the Earth's magnetic field. Questions? Discussion?